Well, it is my pleasure to be back on the podcast today as we address some question and answers with Dr. Russell Moore. I'm Ashley Hales, the producer of The Russell Moore Show, and we are excited to talk about church and leadership and what does it look like to live faithfully as a Christian in today's cultural moment. So thanks so much, Russell, for engaging so many thoughtful questions that have come in from your listeners.
Well, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So our first question comes from a reader and a listener who is, really addressing a lot of these things that I believe your book coming out August 1st, Losing Our Religion. As we look over this landscape of the American evangelical church, are there some examples or microcosms that you would point to that illustrates kind of these divisions going on in the greater American evangelical church? So this comes from a listener who works as an executive for a Christian nonprofit, and he's been tasked with walking his board of directors through this conversation and would be so grateful for any places or sources that you might be able to point him towards to begin to tease those different divisions apart. So other than getting your book, where can he go?
Well, I think the main thing is to realize there's no such thing as the American evangelical church. The church is the church, and what evangelical is a descriptor for a certain kind of revival and renewal movement within the church. And that's one of the reasons why it's so murky and amorphous to define it. And also because I think what we're seeing happening right now is a fragmentation, and that causes some people to have a sense of vertigo and of fear, because what they're looking for is stability. And what I would argue is that the fragmentation might be God doing this. And often what happens is, if you think about what revival looks like, it's order, disorder, reorder. And so often there has to be a pulling apart of some old patterns in order to renew. And so I think that's what's happening right now. I think the main kind of distinction in American evangelicalism right now, and maybe it's just because I'm writing about this right now, so I have it on my mind, but it's a metaphor. If you think about the way metaphors really change the way that we see ourselves and the way that we see the world, it's the difference of metaphors of seeing oneself or seeing the church as a prosecuting attorney, or seeing oneself and the church as a defense attorney. And I think that there's a sense in which the prosecuting attorney kind of imagery makes sense to people, because almost everybody in American culture thinks of himself or herself as a prosecuting attorney for something. And even people have nothing in common, whether it's the kind of social justice TikToker who's policing pronouns, or the Own the Libs right winger who on YouTube who's doing that. Who are the bad people, and how do we win over them? The problem with that is that's not the way the Bible pictures the mission of the church. And the Bible tells us there's already a really good prosecuting attorney, and that's the devil, the one who accuses. And what I mean by a defense attorney is that we start with the understanding of John 3:17, that God did not send the Son into the world to condemn the world, but in order that through him the world might be saved. So what a good defense attorney does is not to be a therapist for the accused. Instead, what you have to do is to say, okay, let's look at the situation you're in and let's deal with that honestly. There are a lot of really honest conversations going on behind closed doors. But what's the purpose of those conversations? It's in order to see this person be acquitted,
Right.
not to see that person to be prosecuted. And so I think that that's really what the mission of the church is. Every time that we're dealing with issues of sin and unrighteousness and all of those things, the Holy Spirit convicts. And what we're doing is carrying good news. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that that kind of confidence, good news confidence, is one of the things that's a real difference between whether
Mm-hmm.
you're operating out of a place of fear or whether you really do see yourselves as being on mission.
Mm-hmm.
So if what it sounds like what he wants is to have a kind of a diagram that says here's this kind of Christian and that kind of Christian and this kind of Christian. Um, Problem is, I don't think that that diagram is worked out yet
Yeah.
because everything is being shaken up, and I see
Yes.
that as actually a good thing, not a not a comfortable
Right.
thing, but ultimately a good thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What would you point to as maybe some of those, those strands in this kind of ecosystem of American evangelical Christianity that has been kind of shaken of late? What might this leader, as he's leading his board through, be able to say, hey, let's look at this box and this box and this box, so we at least have a framework for understanding where do we go from here as an organization?
Well, I think what really is happening right now is not that unusual, except that we're living in a really fast changing, fast paced sort
Mm-hmm.
of social media kind of environment. But it's really what happened in, say, the 1940s and the 1950s in one sense, in
Mm-hmm.
which there seemed to be two alternatives: fundamentalism and mainline liberal Protestantism. And fundamentalism had actually had drifted away from the fundamentals. It
Right.
actually wasn't fundamentalist. It was instead very separatist, very focused on policing a lot of secondary issues, timing of the second coming, and so on and so forth. And so what happened was you have a figure, a Billy Graham, other figures who came in and said, we're going to recover that good news center of what it means to be a gospel Christian. We're going to hold to biblical authority. We're going to hold to the necessity of the new birth. We're going to hold to those things, and we're not going to be angry or scared about it.
Yeah.
We're going to have confidence. And they went forward with that using all kinds of new means that wouldn't have been available before. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that right now what's happening, and again, this has happened before, a lot of times the the kind of connections that we're making with each other are not in terms of big uh, named coalitions with the letterhead.
Right.
Often it's in terms of issue by issue by issue. So you will have some people who are finding themselves together because they care about church planting in the same way.
Mm-hmm.
And they want to do that together. And then they start to realize, well, we actually have a lot of other things that we are in agreement with one another on. Or they find that they also have a concern for both gospel and justice.
Mm-hmm.
And when you have a world that says you got to choose one,
Mm-hmm.
they're saying no, those two things go together. Grace and truth go together, and you find those alliances and those coalitions, but they're organic,
Mm-hmm.
and they're sometimes unexpected and fast changing, and so it's better to be open to that and to say, okay, who's the Cornelius that the Spirit's leading me to that I didn't expect?
Hmm.
Rather than saying, okay, let's just have a meeting and decide what tribe we're in and we're done.
Yeah. 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 I think, you're drawing attention to the ways in which these kind of unlikely partnerships might be really the way forward for the church. I think that's exciting for sure.
And one of the things I was just telling a reporter yesterday, he quoted to me something that I had said to him last year, in which I said the situation is far worse than even I expected, and I've had a dark view for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And I said I wouldn't say that now.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because I am seeing God doing a lot of new things taking
Mm-hmm.
place. And because one of the things that I'm seeing when I'm out, I mean, I'm with 20 something Christians and younger all the time on campuses and other places. And what's really encouraging to me is that even when you have a sense of desperation about what has happened to the American church, and that's almost
Mm-hmm.
always there,
Yep.
the first thing that somebody ever says was, "Thank you for making me realize I'm not crazy." First thing
Hmm.
every time.
Yeah.
W- is even when that's the case, they're not wanting to win when it comes
Mm-hmm.
to their parents or their grandparents.
Mm-hmm.
Instead, these are people who really want to be connected to their parents and their grandparents. I mean, that's just an entirely different thing
Yeah.
than, oh, we're rebels. We're not like the people who came before us, even if
Mm-hmm.
it means that there's a sharp differentiation, maybe even a fragmentation, but it's a different kind of fragmentation. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm really cheered by that right now.
That is encouraging, and I think that brings us to another question that kind of came out of one of our earlier conversations when we had a Q&A, and the episode title was Church. It's complicated. And this listener writes in and says he thinks that you have a relatively optimistic view of institutions. So I'll read a little bit of his thinking here. He says his thinking on institutions have been shaped by two streams of thought. The first has to do with powers and principalities, that all institutions are both a part of God's good creation and are fallen. And the second stream of thought he takes from Edwin Friedman's work, Generation to Generation, which uses the insights of family systems theory to look at institutional life in the sense that institutions as institutions resist change. So he says, in his own work, he's noticed that good-hearted people who wanted to do the right thing were pushed by their institutions to make some bad choices and to maintain the status quo. In each of these cases, he writes, the default mode of the institution is to protect itself. And he says this, he thinks, is a sign of its fallenness. And yet he wants to know if you could just clarify, what is your view of institutions? Are you optimistic? What might be a way forward to think about institutions and institutional belonging?
Well, that's kind of like asking, are you optimistic or pessimistic about persons?
Right.
Because you're dealing with the exact same phenomenon. I'm very optimistic about people because I believe people are created in the image of God.
Yep.
uh, and created for eternity with Him, and there's extraordinary love and flourishing that's found among human beings. And I mean, I'm very pessimistic about human beings, and I know that that we're all bent toward sin.
Yep.
Institutions, there is no existence without institutions of some form or the other.
Mm-hmm.
The family is an institution. There is no procreation without family.
Mm-hmm.
No future, literally no future without
Yep.
family. Church is an institution. It's more than an institution, but it's not less than an institution. And so there are
Mm-hmm.
always going to be groupings of people. And when this listener says institutions are by nature resistant to change, that's exactly right. And that works both in good ways and in bad
Mm-hmm.
ways.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
institutions are meant to say, uh, this moment in time is not the only moment in time. You're connected to people coming before you. You're
Hmm.
connected to people coming after you, and so a tempering on some change is a very good thing. Without it, we would be given over to our worst and most anarchic
Yeah.
sorts of impulses. And and in the end, that inclination toward stability can be weaponized into something evil. Every virtue, every strength in a person or in an organization always can be. And so, of course, this listener is right. I've seen plenty of
Mhm.
people who have kind of outsourced their consciences to
Mm.
their institutions, but institutions rely on people with formed consciences, and people with formed consciences rely on institutions.
Yep.
So if you have one or the other falling apart, then you're going to have a dysfunctional mess. And
Yeah.
so the question isn't, are institutions good or bad? There are some institutions need to go.
Yep.
There are other institutions that need to be reformed. There are other institutions that need to be created and formed brand new. But you have to have both.
Yep.
And if you don't, you're going to have real trouble.
Given, that institutional reality, and given your travel and your kind of pulse on a lot of institutions, whether it's the church as an institution or colleges as an institution, what are you noticing amongst younger Gen Zers about their view of institutions?
I do not encounter what I think many people would assume, which is a institutions don't matter. Let's get
Right.
rid of them. Nor do I, and I think there's a caricature of Gen Z Christians, particularly, that they're just kind of wanting to watch themselves on TikTok, sort of a
Right.
thing. It's just not true, at least among Christians that I find. I find younger Christians who are really uh, disappointed in
Mm.
institutions, but they're not disappointed in institutions because they're saying we shouldn't have them and they're shackling us.
Mm.
They're
Hmm.
disappointed in them because they're saying they're supposed to work a certain way, and they promise certain things that they're not doing and they're not keeping.
Mm.
That's a different sort of, that's
Hmm.
not anti-institutionalism. That's
Yeah.
that's really seeing the
Hmm.
importance of institutions and seeing what happens when either they don't work or when they're working for evil.
Yeah. That
And
sounds
and
like a good
we've seen a
accountability.
lot of that. We've seen a lot of
Yeah.
that. Yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, but here's the tricky part. Um, in any as somebody who's led institutions and I've been a part of some institutions that were sick and in need of change. And in those circumstances, what has to happen is um, there has to be enough of a realization that the institution doesn't work for it to want to change,
Yeah.
without that institution just giving up on the possibility of changing.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to have, that's a very delicate, sometimes, kind of balance that takes
Hmm.
place. So we have a lot of institutions I don't think are going to survive.
Yeah.
And we have other institutions that, because they're so risk averse and they're wanting to protect their stability, are kind of pushing the trauma that they're going to have to endure out into the future. So there's
Mm-hmm.
going to be a lot of tumult that is mandated by realities that people aren't willing to see right now.
Hmm.
So that's why we have to have we have to work with both existing where we can and new institutions to shape and form a generation that actually will be able to lead those institutions toward health.
Yes. Yes, that's so encouraging. Just to me, as a researcher and thinker, and also a mom of some Gen Zers. So yeah, I appreciate that.
The kids
Um,
are all right. I mean, it's
they are.
they are, and it's really remarkable to me how every generation has this view of the next generation that's just so dismissive and caricatured.
Yeah.
And when you actually encounter it, that's just not the reality. And I
Yeah.
think that's especially true right now.
It's good to be reminded, especially if we are in this kind of moment of cultural kind of shaking up,
Yeah.
to not get those doomsday prophecies too
Right.
close.
Right.
Our next question concerns kind of pastoral responsibility. So we'll take, we've taken a broad view, and we'll dive into a particular question here. A pastor writes that his church is in an affluent area of California, with several members who spend exactly 6 months and 1 day in non-tax states to take advantage of tax benefits. But he asks a question: how does he begin to think about his pastoral obligation to them as members of his church? Does membership even make sense when they're not here half the year? Should they be someone else's responsibility when they're gone and mine when they're here? So how does a pastor take responsibility and shepherd his flock, particularly in this context?
Well, I've known churches that have had this situation. One church, particularly that I preached at one time, that said we have to have a certain size building because of the people who are here winter to early spring, but then it looks empty during the summer because those people go back to wherever they're from. I think there is, in those circumstances, you have to encourage those people to be accountable to a body where they are.
Hmm.
And so that's going to depend sometimes on the government and polity of your particular church or tradition or a denomination. But even traditions that would say you can only belong to one church have some category for, in my Baptist tradition, we used to call it watch care
Hmm.
membership, where that very situation, we didn't have many people who were spending 6 months summering. That wasn't that's not the
Wasn't the
people.
thing.
That's not the
Yeah.
people I come from. But we do have people who would be transferred around in the military or be on an
Hmm.
extended sort of work thing somewhere. And there's a category for having a church to which one is
Yeah.
accountable where one is, but then also having a responsibility to the church back home. So
Hmm.
in most cases, that would mean you're being ministered to by the church where you are.
Where,
There
yeah.
would be circumstances that I could see. Maybe this is somebody who gets in the middle of a divorce, or
Hmm.
a child dies, or the person gets arrested for. I mean, there are any number of
Hmm.
situations where those churches would want to be in conversation with each other. Be able to
Right.
say, "Look, we've got a serious situation here with Janet. We need to both be working on that." I think that's the ideal.
Hmm. I guess I wonder too if there's a question underneath that question about why they're leaving and if it's appropriate. How might that pastor deal with that question
Well,
of,
that's what I
are you
thought it was.
trying to evade, taxes and not actually be
Yeah.
a proper citizen?
Yeah, that's where I thought the question was
Yeah.
going. I think it would be different if what you had were people who were seeking to evade taxes. But that's not what they're seeking to do. Instead, they're working within the system the way that it is, and the system expects it to work that way. So I don't see anything to bind somebody's conscience about on that any more than I would say there's something wrong with a more regular situation where
Hmm.
you're filling out your taxes and you're finding those deductions and
Right.
things that you do, rather than saying, well, you ought to be a good citizen and just pay more
Pay
than
your
what they
taxes.
ask. I don't
Right.
think that that's
Yeah.
demanded of people morally.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Maybe that helps ease the pastor's conscience a little bit too, to to figure out how to disciple his people. So,
Yeah.
um,
Now, if a
our
question
yeah,
about their
yeah.
tithing, that's a different question. But
There you go. Yeah. It's always fun to talk about money. But you know,
yeah,
as we think about pastoral ministry, there is one more question about um, leaving church or leaving a particular church or leaving ministry. And a woman writes in saying her husband served in ministry for over a decade at our church. He came on staff when it was planted. They've poured their hearts and soul into their sweet church and love so many members dearly, but they have recently resigned due to leadership dysfunction. And she asks you, given your own experience in leaving a church and leaving denominations, what might be some resources for grieving this loss or this loss of ministry particularly?
yeah. Well, in my case, it was a ministry and it was a denominational home. It wasn't a local church
Specific
home. As a
church,
matter of
yes. Yep.
fact,
Yep.
the church to which we belonged, and almost every church that we've ever belonged to, has been super functional
Yeah.
and
Beautiful.
one of those places you hate to ever leave.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a local church situation. I think that a couple things here. One of those things is to recognize that God's providence is at work in ways that you can't see.
Mm-hmm.
And so neglect the temptation to kind of go back and reenact decisions that you've already made. And in some cases, in my case, I know what I did was to say, I don't trust myself. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to find people who know me
Mm-hmm.
and yet don't have an interest in the situation.
Yeah.
To
Mm-hmm.
say, here's what's going on. What would you do? And so that was pretty much all of COVID for me.
Mm-hmm.
It was Zoom call after Zoom call after Zoom call with people I trusted, but I wouldn't do that with, say, pastors in my denomination who I
Right. Yeah.
trusted and really, but I knew that it's not that I thought that I couldn't trust them in their confidence. It's because they would have a reason to think
Yeah.
you should, and even if they didn't, I wouldn't know that they didn't.
Right.
And
Yeah.
so finding those people that know you and can help you with your motives and also are able to more or less objectively look at the situation. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the things that was really helpful to me is one person that I was talking to said to me, "You're not trying to make a decision. You've already made the decision,
Mm-hmm.
and you just don't know it." So there is a
Mm-hmm.
part of you that has made this decision and is screaming it to your conscious mind,
Mm-hmm.
and you just have to get in alignment with that. And so that may well be the case there. So don't go back and relate. And the other thing is, and this is really important, um, guard yourself against bitterness. And here's how you can know
Mm-hmm.
that. Um, if you're able to pray for the success of that church that you've
Mm-hmm.
left and rejoice when you see signs of those prayers coming true,
Mm-hmm.
then you have a sense of being free from bitterness. Because even when you're in the right, And even when you're 100% in the right and they're 100% in the wrong, you can be consumed by just a holding on to a record of all of those
Yeah.
things in
Mm-hmm.
ways that just are not.
Those
That's
are.
not good for your soul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any thoughts on how to go about that grieving process once the decision has been made? Besides, making sure that that root of bitterness doesn't take root. What does grief? What does that process of lament and grieving look like?
Well,
Or who might go with
if
them?
it's a genuine affection for that church, the grief is going to be real, and it's every bit the same as grieving the loss of a person. Because in a lot of cases, it actually is. What you're grieving is not just ministry in that church, but you're grieving friendships. Even if you still get along with all of those people, there's a different. I mean that has changed. So just like you would with a person, you don't speed that up and put a timetable on it. You instead expect that to be the case. I mean, I decided to leave my place of service that had been my dream job since I was 19. Uh, and and what I really thought people would say, this is the reason you were born is for
Yeah.
this. And I believed that to some degree. Um, in a denominational tradition that I loved and love. At the same time, I lost my father in during COVID in the fall of 2020, around the same time that I was trying to make this decision. And what I have realized as time has gone on is that those two things are remarkably similar in terms of my dad died. I was able to sort of put myself into action and write the eulogy, work on the funeral, get everybody together. And as recently as right before I came in here to record this, a particular song comes, on my Spotify, and I start sobbing, crying. The answer to the way that I deal with that is not to say, "Oh, you should be over the loss of your dad by now."
Yeah.
It's to say, "You really loved him."
Mm. Mm.
And you're always to some degree going to grieve. And it's the exact same thing. I mean, if you think of the church as our mother. Um, I feel like I lost my
Mm.
mom,
Oh, yeah.
church mom, and dad at the same time, and it's the same experience.
Mm.
So I would say just don't rush yourself on that. And the final thing I would say, and I said this to somebody as recently as this past Sunday, is to say sometimes when you come out of a bad church situation, there's a an impulse to say, "I'm gonna pull back and heal up."
Mm.
And, what you think is that you're going to kind of go away and heal up until you're whole again, and then you can reengage in ministry of some kind. And it doesn't work that way because there's never gonna come a point where you're going to say, "Okay, that's all over.
Yeah.
Now I'm ready to serve." So
Mm-hmm.
I would have different counsel for somebody who said, "I'm just gonna go right from some traumatic situation
Right.
into,
Right.
frenetic activity." But
Right.
for people who are really sometimes there's fear there that's
Mm-hmm.
justifiable fear
Mm-hmm.
that says, "I don't want that to happen again." But the problem is if you let that fear direct you, it's only going to increase and
Mm.
you're only going to become more and more scared of using your gifts and engaging in
Yeah.
ministry. So just, I would say, watch that.
Mm. I'm struck with in all of our conversation today the connection of moving from a posture of fear or of scarcity or, the vulnerability of loss, of grief, of dysfunction that happens when we are open to people and institutions. Yeah.
You can't protect yourself from getting hurt. If you're actually involved in loving people, your people will hurt you, and that's the reason you're able to love.
Yeah.
So, that's, I mean, and that goes to every sort of relationship. If you think parenting,
Right.
I want to be in a situation where I know all the right things to do so that this child will never hurt me. The child will hurt you.
Yeah.
The only way the child won't disappoint you or hurt you in some way or the other, or even you just hurt for the child in some way. Only way you could do that is by becoming a sociopath who
Right.
just doesn't care.
Yeah.
And that's no place to be.
Right. Yes. We are wounded healers.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you, Russell, for your own vulnerability and for loving your listeners as well. It's always a pleasure to chat. And if you, listener, have a question for Dr. Russell Moore, please make sure to send it to us at questions@russellmoore.com. Thanks.
I have a new book coming out on August the 1st of this year. It's called Losing Our Religion, an Altar Call for Evangelical America. And really what this book is about is how to navigate the craziness that we're all facing right now. How do we get to the point of exhaustion that so many people are facing? Why are so many people leaving the church? Not because they can't believe what the church teaches, but because they don't believe the church believes what the church teaches. How can evangelical Christianity ever turn around? What would that look like, and how do we get there? That's what this book is about, and you can pre-order it in the show notes, and I look forward to sharing it with you August 1st. And I would just like to say to all of you, if you benefited from anything in this show or you think somebody else would, send it to them. Be sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and it really helps us if you leave a review. And tap on the show notes. You'll find some resources, including how you can have a trial membership to be here with us at Christianity Today. And send us your questions at questions@russellmoore.com. This is Russell Moore, and this is The Russell Moore Show.
The Russell Moore Show is a production of Christianity Today. Executive producers are Eric Petrick, Russell Moore, and Mike Cosbert. Hosted by Russell Moore, produced by Ashley Hales, associate producers Abby Perry and Azare Phelps, CT administration provided by Christine Kolb, social media by Kate Lucky, director of operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens, production assistance provided by Core Media, audio engineer is Kevin Duthu, coordinator is Beth Grabencourt, video producer is John Rowland. The theme song for The Russell Moore Show is Dusty Delta Day by Lennon Hutton.